We are here today with Kwame Raoul, the Democratic candidate for Attorney General. We appreciate you meeting with us and invite you to start by providing an opening statement as to why you think you're the best candidate for the Attorney General.
Sure. First off, my name is Kwame Raoul. I'm a lifelong resident of the state of Illinois. I'm a father of two college-age children that I've now adults that I have raised within the state of Illinois. I'm a lawyer of 25 years. I started my career as a prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. I worked in-house with the community college system, doing employment and labor as well as tort defense, traditional labor negotiations, and a variety of other litigation. And I've worked with two major law firms doing both employment and labor as well as health law. I've tried cases in federal and state court. I've argued cases on appeal. And I've also served 14 years as a policymaker, chair of the Judiciary Committee. I've passed legislation dealing with criminal justice reform, consumer protection, access to resources for victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. I believe that who we elect as Attorney General matters today more than any time in American history. And I think of the three candidates that are competing for the office, I have the most experience to take on this critical role. Attorneys General nationally are taking on roles to keep families together, to protect access to health care, to protect a woman's right to make decisions about her reproductive health care, to protect the environment on so many fronts. Attorneys General nationally and within the state of Illinois are playing more of a critical role than they ever had before.
So before we delve into some of the issues, let's kind of back up. And so how was it you came to be a Democrat?
How did I become a Democrat? Well, I think the values of the Democratic Party are my values, with the access to education for quality education for everybody, access to health care for everybody. These are things that are known to be the pillars of being a Democrat. That said, what I pride myself on, my first day down here in the state capitol, I stepped in the state capitol as a state senator. My predecessor, Barack Obama, was there, and he gave me some advice on that day. And he says, make sure you spend some time with people from other parts of the state and people on the other side of the aisle. Get to know each other, get to know about each other's commonalities, get to know about your differences without letting the differences divide you. If you follow that advice, it will benefit you, and I have followed that advice. I've had the pleasure of working with Republican colleagues who I call my personal friends, and we've worked on criminal justice reform together. Leader Durkin and I sponsored a bill together just last year. We've worked on workers' compensation reform together. I've tackled issues that required bipartisanship, including the abolition of the death penalty.
Not to focus on the negative, but at what was there a time where a difference was so great that you just could not go beyond what it would take to reach some kind of compromise or joint resolution of an issue? Can you think of one?
You're saying on partisan basis?
Yeah. Right.
Oh, sure. I mean, there have been plenty of partisan roll calls. I mean, so there have been various workers' comp bills. Some have been bipartisan, and some that dealt with, well, now after the 2011 reforms that I was a sponsor of, that has led to NCCI recommending reduction of rates for employers. The question is, why aren't these employers getting these reductions of rates? And so we introduced legislation to bring about insurance reforms to get to the bottom of why, when NCCI is saying, as a result of the reforms, the bipartisan reforms that I was a chief co-sponsor of in 2011, why aren't the employers experiencing the rate reductions?
Right.
And as a result, I think there was a partisan roll call on a recommendation for that transparency with regards to insurers.
This is the first time this office has been an open seat in 16 years. Walk us through the job that Lisa Madigan has done in terms of what has she done well and what might you have done differently?
So I think Lisa Madigan has been a tremendous Attorney General. That's why the voters have returned her to the office 3 times after her initial election. She's been a great advocate for consumers. She and I worked together on excessive fees on debit. People paid with debit cards. That's just one of example amongst many where she's been an advocate for consumers. She's been a strong advocate for those who are victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. We worked together on legislation there. I think Lisa has. Attorney General Madigan has stepped up on some of the issues that I talked about on a national level, joining in suits to protect for access to health care, protect against the Un-American act of separating children from their families. She's filed an amicus brief on the defunding of Planned Parenthood. So I think there have been multiple fronts that she's been aggressive protecting consumers in utility cases and so forth. One of the areas that I would say, there are a couple of things. And the other thing that we worked together on was creating a public access counselor within the Attorney General's office. I was the chief sponsor of that legislation. And I don't want to say that Lisa's that she's done an inadequate job there, but the volume of claims that have come to the Attorney General's office has increased incrementally since the inception of the Public Access Counselor's office. And clearly, more resources need to be directed towards the Public Access Counselor's office to adequately respond to those claims. Moreover, one of the policy areas that I've been heavily involved in, I referred to earlier, and I've been involved in on a bipartisan basis. In fact, Bruce Rauner and I co-penned an op-ed soon after he became governor to focus on criminal justice reform. And I think that's one area that we haven't really heard the voice of the Attorney General's office in terms of advocacy. And if elected to Attorney General, you'll certainly hear mine.
Okay. Let's go ahead with that. Elaborate for us, if you were elected Attorney General, what types of issues and changes would you be pursuing in criminal justice reform?
Sure. We have a Department of Corrections that has probably in the mid to upper 40s in the thousands of people that are in there, and it's designed to hold, I think, 32,000 people. There was a commitment with the Criminal Justice Reform Commission to reduce that, to right-size that population within 10 years. There's some recommendations that came out of the commission, including reducing the time for mandatory supervised release to avoid re-referring people to the Department of Corrections just on technical violations. I think there needs to be added emphasis on expanding diversion programs and enhanced investment in community corrections. I sponsored a bill called Adult Redeploy Illinois that's focused just on that. I think we need to evaluate our sentencing scheme comprehensively. The legislature historically has enhanced penalties in part sometimes because any particular legislator wanted to respond to an incident in their district and wanted to send a letter home saying they were tough on crime and enhance the penalty, and it's not proportional to the offense. So I think we need to comprehensively look at the sentencing code and make sure that we don't have certain felonies that ought to be misdemeanors. Those are a few of the things that I think we can do with some leadership from the Attorney General's office. The other thing that I think that's part of it, it touches on criminal justice reform and touches on crime as well, is the Attorney General's office is active in directing resources to victims. And as we talk about the issue of gun violence, we tend not to focus on evaluating the person who evolves into being a shooter. And I think that's something that needs to be done. Arnie Duncan has a program right now where he's focused just on that, and he's targeting individuals that are either likely to be a victim of gun violence or a perpetrator of the same. Approaching them, he's actually giving them employment opportunity, looking at the trauma that they've endured during their life. How is it that they became to be somebody who would be prone to participating in one way or the other, either as a victim or a perpetrator of gun violence? I think, in as much as there's been focus on gun laws to tackle gun violence, what I've advocated for simultaneously is looking at how a shooter becomes a shooter. Because I know of nobody who came out of the womb with a gun in their hands and an attitude that they wanted to shoot their neighbor. Something happened in their lives that made them evolve to that point. I used to be a juvenile prosecutor, and I served both in the child protection side as well as the delinquency side. When a minor would come in having committed a crime on the delinquency side, I would do background checks. A high percentage of the time, I can't give you an exact percentage, that background check would have revealed that that minor had been in the system before as a victim of abuse and neglect. Mm-hmm. There are cycles that have to be broken.
What's the Attorney General's, how would you see putting that into practice?
Sure. The Attorney General, for one, serves as a board member on the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, mm-hmm. Which, if you remember, after there was an audit of violence prevention programs, grant programs involving violence prevention were shifted to the umbrella of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. So most certainly the Attorney General has a voice in how we weigh in on investing in these communities of high violence to interrupt violence. Moreover, the Attorney General has a voice in the General Assembly. I spoke to the Attorney General recently, and we kind of laughed as she said that she's probably passed more legislation as Attorney General than she ever did as a state senator. That is because Attorney General slips on behalf of or in opposition of proposed policy changes. They bring proposed policy changes to legislators to enact into legislation. So the notion, as one of my opponents has said, that the personal views of the Attorney General are irrelevant doesn't match up with the activity of the Attorney General's office, and that's been the activity as the Attorney General has existed under Democrat Attorney Generals and Republican Attorney Generals.
Okay. Backing up a bit on the topic of gun laws, mm-hmm. Walk us through your positions on those, any changes you think need to be made right now?
Sure. I mean, I think there's one that the governor just vetoed, and that has to deal with licensing gun dealers. And this is not embracing policy that would restrict access to guns for law-abiding gun owners. We license all sorts of businesses and all sorts of professionals. And part of that licensing process is to make sure that in the profession that they're engaged in, they don't violate any code of ethics, and so they can be held accountable. I think somebody who deals with the marketing of deadly weapons shouldn't be immune from that licensing. And it's not to cast a shadow upon gun dealers, the vast majority of whom are operating the right way. But if there are gun dealers where a high volume of guns that are utilized in crimes, if we can identify such gun dealers, and if we can identify bad acts, that gun dealer should be held accountable. And I don't see an argument where that shouldn't be the case, because lives are on the line.
Another criminal justice issue you mentioned on your website, you note that you would work closely with local law enforcement and state's attorneys to make sure they have the tools they need to catch child predators. What tools do you see they need that they don't have right now?
Well, the Attorney General's office is charged with heading up the task force in 101 of the counties for internet crimes against children. I met with the retired Naperville detective who talked about how many law enforcement agencies don't know how to identify these predators. So if you think about the place where we think our kids are the most safe, in their bedroom or in your living room, and we give them, and children have access to technology at younger and younger ages. And so they're either by way of their handhelds or their tablets or their laptops, we think that they're safe. They're on their computers and they may be in a chat room, but there's a predator in that room with them. I think the FBI even issued a warning most recently about this. And it is the duty within the state of Illinois of the Attorney General's office in 101 counties to try to coordinate to make sure that law enforcement has access to identify such predators, such possessors of child pornography. And I heard a report about child pornographers who were apprehended, and as part of their being caught, they had to submit to counseling, and a high percentage of them admitted in counseling to be hands-on offenders. And so when you talk about these internet predators, it's not just that they're in possession of child pornography, it's that they're potential hands-on offenders as well.
Mm-hmm. So at the local level, is it an issue of insufficient training, or?
Yeah, it's
Is the county, the AG's office, isn't responsible for
Cook County.
Okay.
And while Cook County State's Attorney's Office has a sophistication that some of the other counties don't have, I think the children of all counties should be protected equally.
Switching gears off criminal justice, corruption is a perennial topic of discussion here in Illinois, unfortunately, for many reasons. It's certainly been thrown around a lot during this race this year. What type of corruption do you see occurring in the state? And on your website, you say you'd propose increasing resources for the division that deals with FOIA and OMA complaints. So talk us through why you think that's the best way to tackle the issue.
I think Justice Brandeis once said it, that's the best cleanser to public corruption is sunshine. When there's transparency, when people are watching, you're less likely to have bad actors. And so that's why, I was a chief sponsor of legislation to create the public access counselor in the Attorney General's office, and that's why I would want to make sure it was adequately resourced. That said, that process, whether it's FOIA or the Open Meetings Act, is not going to catch everybody. And to the extent that there's evidence of a bad actor, whether it's the Attorney General, the local state's attorney's office, or the U.S. Attorney's Office, or the three working together, any evidence of public corruption should be investigated and appropriately prosecuted if the evidence leads that way.
Right now, the Office of the Attorney General can only refer crimes or suspicions of. Would you push to change that?
Well, that's not entirely true. The Office of the Attorney General can work along with and has worked along with local authorities and has prosecuted public corruption. There's actually a fairly long list of such cases. The Attorney General, I can think of a couple. The Attorney General prosecuted a Rock Island County state's attorney and a Rock Island County sheriff. And there's been Department of Human Services employees. There's been a variety of prosecutions.
Okay. Sorry about that.
I'm just kind of interested in that whole general area. It's just candidates in particular throw that word around until people really begin to believe that there's corruption. Is there any whiff of that out there? What?
Certainly there's corruption, and there's corruption in every state and every country and in every profession, right? And so we're a country and we're a state and we're a world made up of human beings, and within that there's going to be some bad actors, and some of them will be elected to office, and we have to be vigilant in making sure. But I agree with you. There's a danger in just throwing around the term corruption. Our governor once referred to the Supreme Court of the state as corrupt, and that engenders distrust for our system and makes it more difficult for folks to do their work. And just because you disagree with a result does not mean that it's corrupt, and it's a dangerous thing to say that. And I would go on to say our governor indicated that he was supporting my opponent in order to have her prosecute the Speaker of the House. Whatever one wants to believe about the Speaker of the House, you ought not be supporting a candidate to carry out vendettas that are political vendettas. That is not how the Attorney General's office should be used. That's not how any prosecutor's office should be used. It's fine to have disagreements and to question the ethics of individuals, but to say that you want somebody to prosecute somebody for a crime that you cannot identify and go on to say that I hope he committed a crime, that is dangerous. That's dangerous to talk about in the context of the Attorney General's office. There was a Pennsylvania Attorney General that was indicted for their abuse of authority.
So all of the suggestions of corruption, by your sense, haven't risen to any level of criminality?
Well, no, we've clearly seen incidents of public corruption in the state of Illinois.
That have been prosecuted.
And they've been prosecuted. And that doesn't mean that everybody who's done something corrupt has been caught. And so there could be incidents of public corruption that haven't been unveiled, or that could be under investigation, for that matter, that we don't know.
You mentioned earlier the issue of health care, providing safeguarding access to it. Walk us through, expand a little bit on the issues you see there and how you would approach them.
Well, yeah. There's been, first off, it's personal to me because I'm the child of a community physician that believed in health care as a human right and never rejected a patient because of their inability to pay, and because I'm a cancer survivor. And so for me, knowing that my access to health care, having had a family history that my father, who I referenced, I lost to prostate cancer, and I lost his father, my grandfather, and my maternal grandfather to prostate cancer. So I, in my situation, was able to answer that question with my physicians about family history. Mm-hmm. And I was able, because of my access to health care, screen year in and year out for prostate cancer. Mm-hmm. And when my PSA increased from one year to the next, we knew that there was a possibility that I had prostate cancer. And with that access to health care, I had a biopsy, and I found out. Prostate cancer is one of the most deadliest cancers for men. Men who don't have that same access to that health care are not going to have that benefit of early detection and are not going to have their lives saved. So attorney generals have been involved collectively in 2 lawsuits recently dealing with the Affordable Care Act. One that tried to remove subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, and most recently, Republican attorney generals have filed lawsuit in the Texas District Court, which the federal government, Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump, has backed away from defending, and it is Democrat attorney generals that are defending the lawsuit to preserve coverage for pre-existing conditions. It's one I take very personal, and it's one that attorney generals are very actively engaged in. You know, it's one thing to say that as a federal legislature, hey, there's some imperfections with the Affordable Care Act. We want to tweak it. We want to do some, but to just repeal with and intentionally undermine what is going to provide life-saving coverage for people is unconscionable to me. The other thing that's not related to the Affordable Care Act is that I would want to lend my eye to is the process of rejection of claims by managed care organizations. I've heard from providers that say that claims are just reflexively being denied. In a way that, that is a kind of a longevity game. How long do you want to hang in there, proving that you have a legitimate claim? What this creates is a potential access for health care challenge for the poor, because you're going to have providers that will not want to go through that dance. It's fine to make sure that to review claims and make sure that they're valid claims. It's something wrong and dangerous to do it just so that you can have a percentage of providers that just give up, and you can thereby save money.
You talk on your campaign site about standing with workers and noted that you introduced legislation that was vetoed that would have created a workplace protection unit in the Office of Attorney General that would have had the authority to initiate labor law enforcement actions. Walk us through why you felt that was something necessary. Yeah,
and it was reflected in the hearing of the bill when I presented it in the hearing. We had a representative of the Department of Labor, and we had examples given of cases that had been investigated by the Department of Labor over a course of time. When they finally made the referral to the Attorney General's office, the statute of limitations had run. So these could be failure to pay minimum wage, misclassification, failing to pay prevailing wage. When you have, this puts law-abiding contractors at a disadvantage. And many of the contractors that violate are out-of-state contractors. That will come in and violate, and sometimes they'll take advantage of individuals, suspecting them to be undocumented and not pay a minimum wage. Or it's just failure to pay prevailing wage, or failure to provide workers' compensation insurance. These types of violations. If there are are bad actors, perennial bad actors. The Attorney General and evidence brought to the Attorney General's attention, the Attorney General shouldn't have to wait. And certainly there shouldn't be instances where valid claims are referred to the Attorney General's office after the statute of limitations have run.
Is this something you'd continue to advocate for as Attorney General?
Most certainly. And I just want to reiterate, it puts in-state contractors who are abiding by the law at a competitive disadvantage.
The environment is something else we've heard you talk a lot about during this campaign. So what are your priorities there, and how would you champion them?
Well, again, there's most recently an incident of the EPA dragging its feet, providing documents to the Attorney General's office to investigate in the Sterigenics case. And again, as a cancer survivor, I'm sensitive to what the residents in the Willowbrook area are going to. I was recently at a campaign event there where some of them approached me, and they're afraid. They're afraid for their children and for their lives. And I've looked at these people, I've looked at them in the eye, and certainly as Attorney General, I would use my authority to investigate, as Lisa Madigan is attempting to do right now, and to enforce laws to make sure that our, the assets that we have are preserved in our clean air and our clean water. So I would aggressively do so. And I would work, to the extent possible in conjunction with the EPA and the Pollution Control Board in doing so. But when evidence is not being turned over, I think that's problematic.
We've had some PolitiFact weighing in on some of the commercials in this race. There's one that you've been airing about your opponent, Erica Harold, and comments she's alleged to have made about whether she would place a child up for adoption with a loving gay couple, but instead put them with the heterosexual couple who was abusively. PolitiFact rated your ad, specifically the part that says, "We know she'd discriminate against a loving gay couple who want to adopt a child, favoring an abusive straight couple instead." PolitiFact rated that ad false. Do you stand by it? She has said multiple times that she now supports adoption by same-sex couples.
Right, and I'll explain why. Sure. As a lawyer, I through the years I've been able to, I've had opportunity to judge and cross-examine on basis of credibility, and so first off, to the alleged comments, I wasn't there, so I don't know whether she said it or not. So you can only infer from what her reaction is. And I didn't investigate this, and I wasn't the one who raised it back in March. When it was raised, she initially says, well, she doesn't recall whether or not she made the statement. Then she says, well, I don't recall, but if I did, my views have changed since then. First off, if it had ever been alleged that I made a statement like that, I could tell you very firmly I didn't make that statement. Or I tell you, yeah, I remember that statement. It's not the type of statement that I would forget whether or not I made. Secondly, with regards to evidence of whether that's still her position, the question is about adoption and placement of foster children. The context that is usually done with regards to a couple is marriage in the vast majority of times. My opponent, when running for Congress, made clear that she opposed marriage equality, opposed gay marriage. She now says that her position on that is changed based on the Supreme Court opinion. The Supreme Court opinion was authored by Justice Kennedy. Justice Kennedy is retired from the Supreme Court, and it was a 5-4 decision. As we all know right now, they're going through a hearing to confirm Justice Kavanaugh. The Obergefell decision was a line of questioning that was heavily discussed during that confirmation because it is suspected that this could be the swing vote that changes the Supreme Court's posture. And that would, in essence, based on what Erica Harrell has said, that her opinion on gay marriage is based on the Supreme Court opinion, would change her opinion.
She also has run an ad about you that PolitiFact has rated mostly false. It claims you've teamed up with House Speaker Mike Madigan in a scheme to raise property taxes and line your own pockets. We wanted to give you a chance to answer that allegation as well.
I welcome that opportunity. The bill in question, as you may know, in the General Assembly, sometimes a bill is passed out and another chamber takes the bill, takes all of the language that you put it in, takes that out, and turns that bill into something else, which is what happened in this case. I passed out a bill that had to deal with the county pension system being able to use electronic copies as original, digital copies as original. That was a subject matter of the bill. The bill was taken in the House, and it was turned into a city pension reform bill because Mayor Emanuel had been negotiating with the unions in the city to deal with the municipal pension fund. And so the language with regards to that pension reform was put in the bill. A component of that at the request of folks in the city was put in the House to give the city authority to levy property tax as part of appropriately funding the pension. Those amendments, while in the House, were removed, and the bill was passed back over to the Senate. At no time that the bill was in my possession did it have anything to do with property taxes. I will go on to add, I've worked at 3 law firms. I've never worked at a law firm that had anything to do with property tax appeals. I've never represented a client in a property tax appeal case. And so while they may have rated it mostly false, I rate it completely false.
Campaign contributions. It's been raised the question that you've taken from public utilities, campaign contributions. The Attorney General's office is involved in that. Talk to us about why you have decided to do that.
I've received contributions from a wide range of individuals, as I have throughout my career, because no political contribution will ever dictate how I act as a public official. My opponent has also received contributions from public utilities. I was asked recently at another editorial board visit which Supreme Court case that I disagreed with, and I said Citizens United. I would love to have a different campaign finance system in the state of Illinois and in the United States generally. In order, I aspire to be the state's next Attorney General. In order to do so, I've got to communicate throughout the state. And if I were to wish to put an ad in your paper, you would charge me a fee for it. In order to put a commercial on TV, I'm charged a fee for it. So I try to do my best to raise money, and I raise from a variety of individuals, many of whom disagree with one another. And that's okay by me, because not a single contribution I've ever received has determined how I would act on a policy matter.
Are there any contributions you would refuse?
Yeah, there probably would. If there was an individual who I really didn't like or didn't want to be associated with, I would refuse or return contribution. I'm not always aware of who I receive contributions from, because the contributions don't necessarily come directly into my hand.
Right. What when you say you don't want to be associated with,
Well, either somebody criminally involved, corrupt. Yeah.
And tobacco companies, the Attorney General's office oversees money having to do with the tobacco-related medical expenses from the settlement. Same principle there, that they don't influence you?
Yeah, if you look at my voting record, and the beautiful thing is that I've got 14 years of service, and if you look at my voting record, I've voted consistently, I think 100% with the posture of the American Lung Association, American Cancer Society on tobacco-related issues. That's a perfect example.
Going back to, we've talked several times today about attorney generals around the country challenging the Trump administration in court on various issues. Would you say you're in agreement with all the cases that Lisa Madigan has taken on? Are there any out there that, she hasn't gotten involved in that you personally would have? I guess
I can't honestly say that I've taken the inventory on that, which ones that she's been involved in and which ones she hasn't. So I don't know that I could honestly, answer that question. But what I will say is, and I can't say that I know every suit that attorney generals have filed, either individually or collectively, against the Trump administration. What I can say is that I've had the opportunity to interact with, to speak with, to engage with in policy meetings with attorneys general throughout the country. And there's some wonderful, well-talented people whose role has been enhanced to a level more important than I think attorneys general have ever played in the history of this country. It used to be, and Sherilyn Eiffel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund said this recently at an ABA meeting that I attended. It used to be that the U.S. Attorney General would come into the states to protect people from overreach of the state government. What we're seeing today is the state attorneys general protecting people from the overreach of the federal government.
What's your take on the mayor of Chicago and the AG just recently announced kind of plans to adopt some new policies relative to the police department
Consent decree?
after the National Attorney General pulled out?
Yeah, so this is a perfect example of what I just said. It's customarily we're used to the U.S. Attorney General stepping in to bring about these consent decrees with police departments, with cities and police departments that have there's been evidence of abuse of authority and systemic problems. I commend Lisa Madigan for stepping up where Jeff Sessions stepped away, because Loretta Lynch was engaged in that process prior to the change of administration, and Lisa Madigan stepped up. So I commend her in doing so. I think there was engagement and listening to community in that process. They've asked for an extended time to get some more community input, but Lisa Madigan knew that she was finishing her last year in office. She could have easily just stepped away and done nothing, and so I commend her for doing so. What I will say is folks who are looking for a cure-all in a consent decree, to lower expectations some. Right. Our work and working to restore the trust in law enforcement has to be continuous, right? I think I have a lot of friends who are police officers and who are hardworking police officers who put their lives on the line, and they're given a bad name by way of some bad actors. We've got to do all we can to create a transparency and restore trust in law enforcement, because it's in the interest of public safety. If we have a distrust in law enforcement, whether it's the city of Chicago, and there's part of the problem is there's so much emphasis on the city of Chicago, there are probably some departments that are far worse than the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. We have to comprehensively work on this issue because it's in the interest of public safety. People need to trust police in order to cooperate with police, and the police need the community to help them solve crimes and to keep the community safe. They cannot do that. They cannot do the job by themselves.
So one more about that kind of tension, federal and state. Are there a couple, one or two or three kind of principles that you would use to guide your intervention or non-intervention in immigration-related issues?
Yeah. So I'm a child of immigrants, right? And my father, as I mentioned before, served 30 years making a contribution to this country. And the President of the United States referred to the nation of origin of both of my parents as an S-hole. That was offensive to people who are Americans, who are of Haitian origin, who know that Haitian soldiers fought 200 years ago for the liberty of this country in the siege of Savannah. And it's a bit of history that Donald Trump probably doesn't know. So it's offensive, and because we are a nation of immigrants. And so immigrants have made contributions, including undocumented immigrants, to this country. They're taxpayers. Yet undocumented immigrants who are taxpayers are not getting the full benefit of the taxes that they pay. We absolutely need comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level. At the state level, we've embraced what is called the Trust Act, and I voted for it, that our law enforcement resources should be used for state law enforcement and not for doing the job of federal immigration officials. And so I would embrace the policies that we've embraced as a General Assembly and as a state in the state of Illinois.
Well, we thank you for meeting with us today and would invite you to give a brief closing statement about why you should be the next Attorney General for the state of Illinois.
Sure. First off, I want to commend Erica Harrell and Bubba Harsey for lending themselves to a campaign that can be very difficult and to run for Attorney General. And as I mentioned earlier, the Attorney General's office has a role now that is probably more heightened and more important than it has ever been in what I believe in American history. So it's important to who we elect, and it's important to look at the different characteristics of the different candidates. I think both of my opponents are impressive young lawyers. I think it's time that we elect somebody to the Attorney General's office who has the experience to do the job. I have 25 years of practice experience. I'm the only candidate in this race that's ever prosecuted a case. I'm the only candidate in this race who's ever defended a public employer in a tort case, an employment practices case. I'm the only candidate in this race who's ever negotiated labor contracts with collective bargaining units that represent public employees. I'm the only candidate in this race that's advanced public policy in the state on a wide range of issues, from criminal justice reform, victims' resources, consumer protection, workers' compensation reform, ethics reform. And so I think while I, again, commend my opponents for lending themselves to this competition, there's a choice to be made that should be made on the basis of having the adequate experience to do this job at a very important time.